Okay. And we are being recorded. So my motivation for this presentation began with a December 13th event that I attended in Washington, D.C. And it was a rally after which 71 people engaged in civil disobedience. It was organized by the Poor People's Campaign, and that is a 2018 revival of an MLK effort. And so got to get coordinated my notes with my slides. So the Poor People's Campaign is a revival of MLK's Poor People's March on Washington. And the revival is being led by Reverend William Barber and Liz Theo Harris. This is not a picture of what happened on December 13th. Our group was much smaller, but this is a picture of what they're aiming for June 18th. And there will be a bus from, I assume there will be a bus from Birmingham to participate in the march on June 18th. And here are the sponsors of that December 13th event. That was a rally, and so also an endorsement implicitly or explicitly of the civil disobedience. And these endorsers include Unitarians, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Disciples of Christ, Catholics, Jewish groups, Hindus, and other religious groups. And also pertinent to tomorrow is the Service Employees International Union, which has about 2 million members. So our experience was that we rode on an overnight bus to DC. It was a small rally, just 300 to 400 people, and maybe from 20 different states. The rally was legal and permitted. It was in front of the Capitol. 4 news cameras filmed the rally. It lasted about an hour to 90 minutes. And what we were for was the Build Back Better Act to ending the filibuster for the Voting Rights Bill. And Manchin was explicitly called on to support these efforts. We sang a few songs. There was a whole lot of chanting. Then we took a small, short legal walk over on the sidewalks to the intersection of Pennsylvania and 3rd. And we milled around in that intersection for a while. And after maybe 15 minutes, police gave the first order to get out of the intersection. And I hastened to the sidewalk. I personally did not hear the second call from the police to get out of the intersection, but we were ordered to vacate. And everyone at that point moved off to the sidewalks, except for the 71 people who had trained in advance and came to DC to be arrested. And they stood in a big circle, maybe 20 police officers circled around them. The police officers were on bicycles. And then over several minutes, the moral witnesses, and that's what the Poor People's Campaign calls civil disobedience. They call themselves moral witnesses. Over several minutes, the moral witnesses were led away in pairs about 50 yards to police vans. And when the arrests were completed, the rest of us walked on sidewalks back to where the buses were going to take us all home. And when we were leaving an hour or so later, looked out the window and we saw some of those moral witnesses who had already been released. And I was told that they had to return the next day to turn themselves in and pay a $50 fine. So the event was written up in the Washington Post and the Hill. And so this is the headline. The article described what we were protesting for, what we were asking for. So it was a full discussion. And so I came back and I shared these observations with New Horizons Friday Forum, which, by the way, we are now Monday meeting and we welcome you to join us for a good conversation. When I shared it with my friends in the Friday forum, I heard different perspectives, including some disapproving ones. And so that's what prompted me to learn more about civil disobedience and invite more discussion. So at the end, I'm very interested in your thoughts. I assume that the political views of you vary, and I assume that your take on civil disobedience varies. That said, I did not find instances where conservatives have engaged in civil disobedience to advance conservative causes. So I couldn't find civil disobedience to demand tax cuts or shrinking the size of governments or restricting abortions or protecting gun rights. And so when I was looking for examples of civil disobedience by conservatives, I did find this article from 2015. And so it reinforced my sense that this is not a tool that's used by conservatives. So to the extent that this whole presentation is slanted away from conservatism, that's why. And it's also heavy on climate change because that's what I'm most familiar with. So when I began my Google search, I landed first in the scholarship, and there is a lengthy article in Stanford University's Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And the punchline is, scholars disagree on nearly every aspect of civil disobedience. Their analysis is way broader, deeper, and more contentious than what I'm going to present to you. And I'll be adding info from press accounts and other sources. So according to the Stanford Encyclopedia, the most widely accepted view of civil disobedience is still that from John Rawls. And John Rawls was a leading political philosopher of the 20th century. He's prominent enough that I learned about his work over in the economics curriculum. And this is how he viewed civil disobedience, and this is the definition I'll be using today. First of all, civil disobedience is public. It's open, not anonymous. It's essentially a communicative act. It's a kind of symbolic speech to convey a message to certain audiences, such as the government or the public. And typically, civil disobedience is a call for reform or a remedy of some wrong. It's nonviolent, and there is a question around whether damage to property is violence, and I'm going to return to that later. But why avoid violence? Violence obscures the communication of the disobedient act and is more likely to alienate the public, say the scholars. So nonviolence is more effective at persuading people. Also, violence is more likely to be met with violent repression. Moreover, many activists strongly oppose violence and are often protesting against violence. So it's consistent that they themselves would use nonviolent methods. And finally, the scholars say nonviolence can be a means for oppressed people to regain dignity and self-respect. It's also, civil disobedience also is conscientious, principled, serious, based on deep and sincerely held moral or political commitments. And the disobedience are willing to accept the consequences of their actions. So in an important sense, civil disobedience entails obedience to the law, and that people take responsibility for and accept the legal consequences. So inviting the punishment demonstrates their endorsement of the legal system's legitimacy. So they aren't in a rebellion against the system, they're not committing an ordinary crime that they're hoping to get away with. So they're really showing respect for the system by accepting the consequences of what they do. So most scholars agree that civil disobedience requires this willing submission to arrest and prosecution. They don't always agree on whether the disobedience should plead guilty or not guilty. And some argue that pleading not guilty is a way to put a cause before the jury and explain the cause to the jurist. Say with climate change, we did this because it was necessary for us to do it. So reason of necessity as a defense. And so they plead non-guilty to use a trial to communicate about their action. Henry David Thoreau of Walden Pond is widely credited with coining the term civil disobedience. And for years, he refused to pay his state poll tax as a protest against slavery, the extermination of Native Americans, and the war against Mexico. This was his way to withdraw his cooperation from the government. And he called on his fellow townspeople to do the same. Thoreau went to jail in 1846. So what does civil mean? For Thoreau, it referred to the relationship between civilians and their civil government. These days, it more commonly refers to civility, a kind of self-restraint, behaving in a dignified and respectful manner. So no conduct that would be offensive or insulting or obscene. There are two types of civil disobedience, direct and indirect. And direct civil disobedience is breaking the law that is opposed. So this is Dion Diamond, and he was part of a small group that led a 2-week campaign that resulted in the integration of restaurants in Arlington, Virginia, and restaurants in Alexandria and Fairfax soon followed. Rosa Parks comes to mind as somebody who broke the law, the very law that she was opposed to. Susan B. Anthony also engaged in direct civil disobedience. Her crime was voting while female. So it was against the law and she went and cast a ballot anyway. And you might have noticed that President Trump announced that he would pardon Susan B. Anthony. And some responses to that, including from the Susan B. Anthony Museum, was that she would not have approved of a pardon because she didn't think she did anything wrong. She was found guilty and she was fined $100, and that's nearly $3,000 in today's money, and she refused to pay it. So I don't know if that's willing to accept the consequences of her actions or not, but an example of our indirect civil disobedience means breaking a law that, other things equal, the people don't really oppose in order to protest against another law or policy. So this is a picture of the Sunrise Movement, which is young people in their teens, mostly in their teens and 20-somethings. And they were in Speaker Pelosi's office. 51 were arrested. So their crime was to be where they were not supposed to be. And I don't know if part of it was also because they were loud, but they were chanting. Not all unjust laws can be disobeyed directly. And the Sunrise Movement is an example of that. Another example is when a same-sex couple was living in a jurisdiction that forbade same-sex marriages. Well, the couple could not get married in defiance of the law. So they had to do something else. Another example of indirect civil disobedience, as I see it, is Thoreau not paying his taxes to the general government budget. Another example of indirect civil disobedience was in 2011. This is NASA scientist James Hansen. He's a hero of mine. He, in 1988, as a NASA scientist, 1988, he was the first person to give testimony to the US Senate about climate change, that it was happening and that it was a danger. And his government inaction over the years has led him to be more and more of an activist, which is sort of, for many scientists don't want to be in the public sphere with activism, but the severity of the problem led this scientist to become very active, and eventually led him to engage in civil disobedience. And he was among those who got arrested. He's been arrested more than once. This action in 2011 had 1,253 people arrested, over a 2-week period. The oldest one was 86 years old, and he wore a sign on his neck that said, "World War II vet, handle with care." The recruiters for this action, again, 1,253 people. I don't know how many of you will recognize these names, but these are people who signed a letter recruiting other people to the action. So Wendell Berry, you might know, James Hansen, again, Wes Jackson, Bill McKibben. So over in the climate world, these are big names, and they do have national reputations. So I want to say that perhaps, and I don't know this for a fact, but perhaps this is a possible exception to the notion that conservatives don't engage in civil disobedience. Many conservatives are very concerned about climate change. And I've worked alongside conservatives in lobbying Congress for government policies to address it. So I don't know if any conservatives were among the 1,200 plus who engaged in civil disobedience, but to me it's conceivable. And what they were protesting was the, there's Bill McKibben. Oh, and by the way, what their illegal act was to sit in a place that was reserved for tourists to take photographs. So there's a spot out in front of the White House that's reserved for people to come up and take a picture of the White House. And these people sat in that space and refused to move. And what they were protesting was the Keystone XL pipeline that brings really, really nasty materials down from Canada. So this oil sands is particularly nasty, even for a fossil fuel. So other examples of indirect civil disobedience are anti-war protesters staging sit-ins in government buildings, and of course the December 13th action of standing in the intersection. All right, so what is violence? I'm going on a tangent here, but it was interesting to me. So this is just a tangent on violence. And this is a quote from Senator Manchin that he stated on December 20th when he said he was not going to vote for the Build Back Better Act, or bowed out of that. And he said, and this was on a radio show, "They figured, surely to God, we can move one person. We surely can badger and beat one person up. Surely we can get enough protesters to make that person uncomfortable enough that they'll just say, okay, I'll vote for anything. Well, guess what? I'm from West Virginia. I'm not from where they're from, and they can just beat the living crap out of people and think they'll be submissive, period." So this is just a reflection on what is violence. So did he really feel like he'd been subject to violence? He had faced legal protest like this one near his DC home. He lives on a boat. It's often named in the press as a yacht. People with real yachts, yacht makers know this is not a yacht. It's a very small scale, but that's, so he lives on this houseboat when he's in DC. So he's faced legal protests like this flotilla there at his home. There was a significant TV ad in West Virginia trying to get him to vote for the Democrat agenda. An op-ed written by Bernie Sanders made national news. The op-ed was in a West Virginia newspaper. And certainly he's heard a lot from his congressional colleagues. And on December 13th, the event that I went to, where there was civil disobedience, he was called out by name. And I don't know if Manchin was even aware that people were getting arrested to protest his inaction. But do all of those words, do words constitute violence? Well, the language is not illegal, so no law is broken. So it's not civil disobedience. And but whether or not it's violence, I guess, is a judgment call. Some language is commonly considered to be psychological violence. If you use language that denigrates and humiliates, then scholars consider that to be violence. But again, even if you think of it as violence, it isn't illegal, so it's not civil disobedience. Property damage is broadly considered to be violence. That is, authorities, much of the public, and many scholars think that property damage is violence. John Locke was tremendously influential at the founding of the United States, including an influence on Thomas Jefferson when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And Locke held that it's the duty of government to protect the natural rights of people. And for Locke, the natural rights of people include life, liberty, and property. So private property is often seen as an extension of one's person, and the assumption that property damage is likely to lead to violence against persons. And here's a quote from John Locke. It's lawful for a man, he says, it's lawful for a man to kill a thief who has not in the least hurt him, nor declared any design upon his life, because I have no reason to suppose that he who would take away my liberty would not, when he had me in his power, take away everything else. So Locke had a pretty strong view about you can kill a thief. Not all agree with that. Some scholars believe that non-violence can accompany property damage if the damage is minor and if it clearly relates to the civil disobedience message. So an example here is of people who shut off pipelines. And these were pipelines that bring tar sands down from Canada into the United States. And others have done the same type of action. And these people consider themselves civil disobedience. These five were the so-called valve turners, and they temporarily stopped the flow of most of the oil coming from Canada's tar sands for a few hours. This woman is the woman on the left is an editor and a poet, and beside her is a retired attorney, 64 years old. But here's what the action was. They went inside the fence, they clipped the chain and turned the valve that turned off the flow of the tar sands. So the older woman there says, like mothers everywhere, I don't think I can see that on my screen. I love a deep love. I act from a deep love that extends to all children and young people and all living beings on this planet. So this is to help you get to know one person who does civil disobedience. I have signed hundreds of petitions, testified at dozens of hearings, met with most of my political representatives at every level, to very little avail. I have come to believe that our current economic and political system is a death sentence to life on earth, and that I must do everything in my power to replace these systems with cooperative, just, equitable, and love-centered ways of living together. This is my act of love. So again, I'm not endorsing it. I'm sharing with you what she has to say. So what is the, to let you know what became of these people, they were charged, including with felonies. And the two women were set to go to trial by jury, and they were going to use the climate necessary defense. So they were going to say, yes, we did it, but the situation of climate change demands that we do it. And they were going to have experts in, including that NASA scientist, James Hansen. He was going to be one of their witnesses. And so in that way, they were very excited about going to trial. And things were progressing that way. And then at the last minute, the judge abruptly acquitted them of all charges. And they were happy to be acquitted, but they were very disappointed that they didn't get to make their public case to jurors. Among the men, one of them spent 2 days in prison and 30 days of community service. And again, felonies charges, I think, were all around. Another one of the men was just, what do you call it? The punishment was going to be 3 years in prison, with 2 of those suspended. And so he spent 1 year in prison, and another one had a 3-year sentence, but it was deferred. But he did have to pay $4,000 for restitution and court fees. So again, the question is, was this violence? The only property that was destroyed was to clip those chains. What is the value of civil disobedience? And this is from the scholars. The scholars say that it strengthens the social and legal order, that it inhibits departures from justice and corrects them when they occur. That's from John Rawls. Civil disobedience, according to scholars, strengthens democracy by enhancing democratic legitimacy. It puts a neglected issue on the political agenda and raises awareness about its stakes. Civil disobedience contributes to and informs democratic deliberation. It constitutes a form of democratic empowerment. This exercise of political agency is especially meaningful for marginalized groups. Individuals discover and realize their power, work together and forge bonds of solidarity, and engage in democratic politics. How should the state respond to civil disobedience? Some people say with the same punishment for anybody else who broke the same law. So if you are standing, if you're blocking an intersection for civil disobedience, or if you're blocking an intersection for some other nefarious reason, you should get the same punishment. Other people say that civil disobedience should have less punishment because, as in the previous slide, civil disobedience strengthens the democracy. So these are people who are putting themselves out there, and so they should receive less punishment. And others say that the punishment for civil disobedience should be more severe because of their open disregard for the law. And to punish them more severely will reduce the risk of the proliferation of civil disobedience. And even worse, the possibility that the civil disobedience will escalate into violence. So different views on how the state should respond. This is a long quote, but this is the retired lawyer was in a radio interview, and this to her is the value of what she did. She says civil disobedience does not work immediately. It's not like you turn off the pipeline and you really expect they're going to keep it off forever and ever because you're so brave. But the thing is, when people step up and do something like that and take that kind of risk, it makes other people, for one thing, listen to us in a different way. If we just protest and write letters and make phone calls, it's pretty easy for folks to shut down and not pay attention. But when you've been willing to take a lot of legal risk onto yourself, they do tend to stop and say, hey, why would you do such a crazy thing? And that gives you a chance to tell them why you would do such a crazy thing. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it also, honestly, and this relates to the previous basis for giving civil disobedience more punishment. Honestly, it's like when you do something like that, and there were just 5 of us, and we managed to shut off the equivalent of 15% of the US daily oil used that day with nothing more than a pair of bolt cutters and some research. When you do something like that, and you make it clear to people that those companies need our implicit consent in order to operate. They have millions of miles of pipeline. They have oil trains coming through all of our communities. If we know that, if we let them continue on with business as usual, they are destroying the world as we know it, quite literally. If we can step up and stop that, whether it's chaining ourselves to governor's offices, whether it's swarming onto sites where they're trying to build new infrastructure like we saw at Standing Rock, whether it's shutting off pipelines or blocking oil trains, there are numerous ways that people can stand up and make a real difference and make it clear that we are not going to go down without a fight. So this is an illustration to support the view that it should be, civil disobedience should be more severely punished because they were hoping to encourage others to follow them with disobedience. A word on the suffragist. For years, President Wilson did not support the suffragist, and they were repeatedly arrested for unlawful assembly, disorderly conduct, and disrupting traffic in front of the White House, and they refused to pay fines. Alice Paul, one of the leaders, one of the suffragist leaders, was sentenced to 6 months in a workhouse for picketing. And she was subjected to physical and mental examinations by 5 physicians against her will. When Paul started a hunger strike out of protest at the workhouse, she was force-fed. Several days later, 33 imprisoned suffragists were brutally handled by guards for refusing to work or eat. And these reports of abuse appalled President Wilson, prompting him to immediately pardon the prisoners. So although other forces were at work, after years of refusing to do so, this was when Wilson joined the suffrage crusade. So the Poor People's Campaign, again, being a moral witness is what they call being a civil disobedient. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they've done. They want you to know that their actions are well planned and organized. Every participant every moral witness, every person who's going to be arrested is extensively trained in the methods of MLK and nonviolent civil disobedience. Some of the Poor People's Campaign got arrested down in Montgomery. They occupied a space inside the Attorney General's office building, and they also put a shroud over the statue of Jefferson Davis. They were promoting voting rights and Medicaid expansion. So about 12 people were arrested down in Montgomery. They got handcuffed with plastic ties. They offered no resistance, and they walked it over to the holding area and the police vans. The Poor People's Campaign has legal observers and a legal team to accompany them to court. Bail is worked out in advance, and they're out of jail the next day. So some of you might know Reverend Carol Foster, a Birmingham person, and she was arrested down in Montgomery, and she's been arrested in DC. And I asked her what it felt like to be arrested, and what she said to me was, it's being part of a larger movement, making the world a better place for all people, amplifying the voices of poor and low income people and standing in for them. It was an empowering act for her. So is it effective? These are pictures from New Hampshire back in the 1970s, where people were, the Clamshell Alliance were protesting a 2-unit nuclear power plant in Seabrook, New Hampshire. It was under construction when the accidents of 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986 occurred. Thousands of people were arrested over the years, including more than 1,400 in 1977, and that really put the Clamshell Alliance on the global marquee. I want to share with you something about their training. Before anyone got arrested, they had to undergo a 6 to 8 hour training where there was role playing, with half of them being police officers and half of them being demonstrators. They were trained in specific ways to stay safe. For example, get in a fetal position with your backpack on your back. They had role playing of court trials and incarceration. They were trained in how to de-escalate tensions on site, how to isolate hecklers and not get involved with troublemakers. They learned how to share leadership and make collective decisions. They were directly confronting oppression, prejudice, sexism, and something that they did in their own training was they would have observers to their training count how many times men said what a woman had just said, the man speaking as if it was his own idea. So again, they were doing some feminist training in there because they were aligning themselves with some higher ideals. They taught empathy skills that they could use not only internally, but also with the police or pro-nuke people. So both sides claimed victory at the end of this process, and the process ended when one of the 2 proposed nuclear reactors began operation. So the utility official said, we won, we got the plant built, it's running. The opponents counter that only one of the 2 got built, and the country stopped building new nuclear plants for more than 2 decades. Here's the perspective of one of the people who got arrested and was involved with the Clamshell Alliance. The concern of activists made things like 3 Mile Island a major event, not a back page event. When something like Chernobyl or Fukushima, a global event happens, there's more global resistance. So he's claiming credit for the greater public awareness and dubiousness about nuclear power. He went on to say it united people. It was very uplifting. It had a real sense of community. We can make a difference. We did make a difference. Did we stop it? No, but I love democracy, and this was democracy in action. And I'll just reiterate, I'm confident that many people among you in this audience support nuclear power. And so for you, these are not the good guys. So is it ever justified? Is civil disobedience ever justified? One answer is no. If a society is reasonably just, then citizens have the political obligation to obey the laws. Others say, yes, our political obligation is to resist injustice and promote fairness. But if we do break a law, it's our duty to disobey civilly. So I wonder which camp you're in. What's the bar to justify civil disobedience? Scholars say, undertaken as a last resort. Citizens should first use proper legal channels of political participation to express their grievances. I've shared with you, James Hansen has done everything legally possible, and he ultimately resorted to civil disobedience. And the attorney on that long quote also said that she had done the petitions, spoken to lawmakers, done everything she could. So for her, it was also a last resort. So to remind you, though, of what some legal tools are, which is where most people start. This is the People's Climate March, and what year was that? I forget. This is a earlier climate march in pictures from 2014 in New York City. And I just offered this for those of you that haven't been in marches. My experience, and I've participated in many, many marches, and my experience is always that they're totally nonviolent, upbeat, happy, even though we're out there for a serious reason. But here are some of the images, and there's a lot of creativity. This is an arc, and I guess they're worried about sea level rise. The giraffe is an endangered species. To change everything, it takes everyone. Here's fossil fuels, a fossil, but you see sort of the happy, upbeat faces. A lot of creativity in the signage. Another legal activity that I participate in is I'm active with the Citizens Climate Lobby. And here we are pre-pandemic and our lobby day in June, where we go into over 500 congressional offices in a single day in teams. And in the Zoom era, we've had to do these online. And here is Representative Gary Palmer and our a local CCL team. And what we have spent the lion's share of our time promoting is pricing carbon. So share that with you. Here are all the places in the world that already price carbon. Here are places in the United States that price carbon. And it's a great time for everybody, just by the way, to contact President Biden and encourage him to stand strong with keeping strong climate measures in the Build Back Better Act. Writing letters to the editor, and I'm just heartbroken that the Birmingham News no longer prints letters to the editor. And of course, vote and encourage other people to vote. So there are lots of ways to do that. Birmingham is GASP, the local environmental group, is putting together a slate of policies to take to the Birmingham City Council. It's a Green New Deal for Birmingham. And a piece of that, an early piece in this in our process, is to enlist Birmingham high school students to come up with a design. If you know any students who live in Birmingham, there's an opportunity to win a $500 prize and to see their design on t-shirts. So please go to the GASP page, the Green New Deal page of GASP, and be on the lookout for events related to this over the next year, because there's a lot of outreach to community about what should be in city of Birmingham approach to climate change. I'm not going to do this, but there are lawsuits against fossil fuel corporations. There's also the big divest movement where pensions and others are being encouraged and are increasingly dropping fossil fuels out of their portfolios. This is just a random piece of beautiful art that I included. It was a temporary exhibit as like for a year in, well, I'll let you guess what city that is. A recent article in was examining where the climate movement should go, and I'll just say that two perspectives among the perspectives in there are some people are saying we need to get more aggressive, we need to be more willing to do property damage, what we're doing it and working quickly enough. So there are some people who hold that view. On the other extreme, there are people who are saying we just need to double down, triple down on voting, and we need to just really put our energy into getting voters out who will vote their preferences on climate. But so who knows where we're headed? My personal opinion is a sort of all of the above. I'm not big into, I do not support property damage, but otherwise I think we need every type, it's an all hands on deck moment for the climate movement. Okay, finally ending, and here are questions I'm going to leave you with. Was civil disobedience essential? Was it essential to the suffragist, to the civil rights movement, to the anti-nuclear power movement? And for me, the pertinent question is it useful to the climate movement now? The Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock is operable. It is operating, but those you've heard about that because of the both the legal protest and the civil disobedience there. So it really was a message to fossil fuel companies that if you want to think twice about new pipelines, because you've got an extra cost, and that is to deal with protest. This is a different Keystone XL pipeline protest from the one where James Hansen was arrested. This was a few years later, and these are college students laying down on the ground. They were arrested. Again, you've heard of Keystone because of both the legal and illegal actions against it. The Sunrise Movement, if you're aware that young people are rising up to some degree around or to protect the climate, it's probably, you've heard about it through the Sunrise Movement. Line 3 pipeline is another example this past summer where lots of people got arrested. It too is operating, so it was not successful in that sense. So again, the questions: was civil disobedience essential? Is civil disobedience useful to the climate movement? What was the news coverage of the December 13th events in DC helpful to the cause of getting the Build Back Better Build Back Better Act passed? Do you have a personal story about civil disobedience? Thank you. If you'd like a climate presentation of any sort, I would love the opportunity. That's where you can reach me, northrop@southwestern.edu. And I'll leave these questions up for another 5 or 10 seconds, then I'll stop sharing so that we can see each other better. So was civil disobedience essential? Is it useful to the climate movement? That's a very pertinent question for me as one who is considering it. Is the coverage helpful to the cause? And do you have a personal story about civil disobedience? All right, interested in anything you got to say?
So folks, you can just raise your hand or just put a question in the chat or just blurt it out.
So where do right-wing people who live in the Northwest and refuse to pay their taxes and occupy federal lands, is that an act of civil disobedience, which you would put under the same umbrella as the things that you've mentioned today?
Well, the ones I've read about in the newspaper have been violent. So if it's violent, it is not civil disobedience. If they are trying to avoid going to jail, it's not civil disobedience. So to be civil disobedience, according to this John Rawls and most widely accepted definition, it has to be nonviolent and people have to accept the consequences of their actions.
Well, a number of them have gone to jail for not paying their taxes, and that wasn't violent.
Okay, did they resist?
I don't know, but I haven't read about all of them resisting.
Okay, well, so according to the definition, and it's a case by case sort of assessment. But if they were public, so they weren't trying to sneak it, if they were public, and if they were nonviolent and conscientious, which they clearly were, and if they accepted the legal consequences, then that is civil disobedience. Thank you.
Emily, I think that the sad truth is that most people are for civil disobedience for the causes they believe in and are violently against civil disobedience by those who they disagree with. But I think that if you are for civil disobedience of any sort, then you have to be willing to grant the right of civil disobedience to everybody else. And that is something that we are very resistant against. I know I would, almost fight to the death to prevent dictatorship in this country. And yet these people have as much right to disobedience as I do as a tree hugger. So how do you feel about that?
Well, thanks. It was helpful for me to hear William's specific example, and I guess I need to hear one from you. I mean, nobody thinks of the scholars, and I don't think of January 6th as civil disobedience because it was violence and because people were not stepping up. They weren't waiting there saying, handcuff me, which is what civil disobedience, wait for the police to come, put handcuffs on them and take them away. And that was certainly not the case of January 6th. So can you think of a specific example of something along the lines that you were describing?
Well, what about the march in Charlottesville, which was actually legal until they killed somebody, but that was just one person. Had he not driven his car or truck into that poor woman who was counter-protesting him, it would have been perfectly fine disobedience. But it was really just a white nationalist movement. And all the reasons they were there were wrong reasons, but yet they had the right to do it.
Right. And to the extent that they were not breaking the law, they were not engaged in civil disobedience. So if you get the permit and you're not engaged in civil disobedience. So like you, I don't know what law they broke until, you know, a murder was happened.
Well, I mean, I can then switch over and give the example of the Nazi March in Skokie, Illinois, in which they were not allowed, or they did not get the permit, and yet the Civil Liberties Union fought tooth and nail to allow them to march through Skokie, which would have been civil disobedience.
Well, I agree with your initial position that that civil disobedience ought to be allowed. But I also just remind us that it's public and it's nonviolent, it is illegal, and people stand there and say, take me to jail. So if it's civil disobedience, I mean, you're raising the important issue of, you know, freedom of expression. There's some speech that is just horrendous to hear, and the ACLU is out there saying, but yes, this is protected speech. So that, you know, so I appreciate how, you know, the rub, the chafing at that, but I'm far enough into thinking about this that I support, you know, I hate the way some people vote, frankly, but, you know, they get to vote. I hate the cause that they are engaged in for civil disobedience, but if they're doing it, then they non-violently accepting the responsibility for it, then I support. I personally, you asked me, yeah, I do support civil disobedience. The next question is, am I going to engage in it? I don't know yet.
What about the consequences of some of these actions, such as the shutting down of pipelines, particularly in the Northeast, where people now are dependent upon oil? The pipeline for natural gas is shut down. Natural gas is cleaner, less expensive, and could be a good interim for the people in the Northeast.
I don't understand your question.
Well, the question is, do the people engaged in this civil disobedience consider the consequences?
So I'm sure in terms of climate, they're also considering the consequences of climate change. But I think that you're really pointing a good way at what is violence and what is not violence. And so even standing in an intersection, if somebody has a medical emergency and needs to get to the other side of that intersection to get to the hospital, you're doing harm. And so if they shut off a pipeline and somebody's home is cold, is that violence or is that non-violence? So I guess I'd ask, do you see that as violence?
Well, I guess my point more is the fact that my point is more to a short-term solutions to the long-term solution.
Right.
And we're shutting off the short-term solutions for a long-term solution. And that's the problem. And my question is, when you get into a civil disobedience of any kind, do you consider the consequences of what, or maybe the other side of what will happen?
So I hope so. That's all I can say is I hope so. And I hope people engage in these for, you know, moral reasons. And I hope that they are considering the implications and the consequences of what they're doing.
Yeah, I would hope so too, but obviously when they shut down that pipeline and they said the only damage was to the chain, they're totally wrong in not thinking about the people that they hurt by that.
Well, that particular action did not hurt anybody in that way. Before they turned it off, they called the company and said, we're about to turn it off. And so within just, I think the oil didn't flow for maybe half a day. And so to my knowledge, there were no human repercussions in terms of people not being able to crank their car or heat their home. It wasn't shut off for that long.
Well, maybe not. How do they know?
Well, there were no gasoline shortages reported in the paper, and there were no homes that, so I feel comfortable in that particular action, that people weren't hurt in that way. There's enough redundancies in the supply of oil that that those basic necessities still got met. But I take your point.
Thank you.
When the Russians cut off their pipelines to Europe, there's certainly a lot of howling and very effective tool for their political aims. But in the issue of the overall issue that you're interested in of climate change and long term, I'm concerned that anybody with a brain that works should be aware of the perils that are looming. But I don't think the majority of the population in the world is capable of getting on board until it's more affordable. And you can say, yes, but you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. But until there's a way to do it that is not as potentially expensive as it looks like right now, I'm afraid we're not going to make much progress. Do you see any changes or plans looming that are going to make it more affordable to the average individual?
Well, as much as I relish that question, let me stay for a little while on civil disobedience and see if anybody has any other questions or comments about civil disobedience. Somebody else who hasn't spoken yet? Got anything?
I've spoken, but I would like to make one more point, if it's okay with you. I think that when you live in a civilized society, there's a certain social compact that you're going to follow the rules, which means that you're going to obey the laws. And as much as I sympathize or am completely on the side of some of the principles that you're espousing, human rights, the future of our children and grandchildren to live in a healthy environment, and so on and so forth, I still think that civil disobedience by its very definition is breaking the law. And I think breaking the law is not something that you can excuse away if you believe in the social contract of living in civilization.
Thank you. I'm very interested in other people's views on civil disobedience. Was it essential for the suffragists, for example? Is it useful today? I'm happy to have a question, but I'm also happy to have your current thinking. And if you're like me, thinking evolves. But what's your current thinking? Somebody who hasn't spoken yet? I can see the other Ron making his way to his.
Well, I would like to thank all those suffragists for what they did. They were important and essential.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, and also in the civil rights, I think that mostly it was nonviolent, but at least on the side.
A comment from Southern Africa.
That's where he's from.
You know, everybody knows the history. If there had not been violence of some sort, not necessarily physical, but considering sanctions as a violence against a population that would suffer enormously by that, if people cannot tolerate a certain amount of hurt for the greater good, then where is their moral principle? You know, you see it in so many ways. One man's insurrection is another man's freedom fighter. It's the perspective of what they could do, and does one have it in oneself to see another perspective that is valid and maybe not in your direct personal interest or the way you have voted or the number of people on your side as against the others. So to take the newspaper cliche, if it bleeds, it reads. There's got to be a certain amount of bleeding on one aspect of one part of the population to free up some other population. That's morality in my interpretation. So I see it justified.
What about if the freedom fighter is a brown shirt in Munich in the early 30s, though, 1930s?
In a human world, you'll always find one group or another or an individual trying to take advantage of another. You have to differentiate that from the broad principle.
Somebody was just raising her hand. Who was that?
Lynn Stafford.
All right, go for it, Lynn. Lynn, you need to unmute yourself.
Just a little bit of history about Martin Luther King that I think is pertinent. And that is that after the bombing of the church in Birmingham and a few things, there was a serious threat of Black violence against whites. And Martin Luther King chose to get that march together to go across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to divert them from the violence. And in effect, he caused violence upon his own people. But it worked. It made the point. But his reason for beginning that, from what I understand and what I've heard, was specifically to stop the greater violence that would have been a civil war.
Thank you. Someone else who hasn't spoken yet? I guess Ron Vinnick, I'd like to, what your comment brought to mind is what was going on in South Africa to me feels more like a rebellion. I mean, it was overturning the system. And civil disobedience is not sort of open rebellion. Civil disobedience are aimed at, a particular policy or practice or institution. And so, and nonviolence is often chosen as the most effective tool for communicating, the complaint and promoting a solution. So, violent rebellion, the United States was born, and a new South Africa was born. So I see that as more the South African more as a rebellion, but
Not as a question of scale. One was a small event focused, the other was the same intent, but involved a much larger group of people.
thanks. Anybody else? questions or comments?
I have a book that, I don't know if you can see it. This is I call it Rally for Change. And it's been when my husband and I have gone out to different things, for example, and my children say, Mom, we are so proud of you. The cover of it, I'm holding up a sign that says, you can't bully us out of our First Amendment rights. So I've been to Sensible Gun Control rally. Right about the time of the pandemic, I wanted to go to the Black Lives Matter they were having one, where was it? It was somewhere in Mountain Brook. It was kind of small, but I wanted to go to that, but my husband was very concerned about some health problems, and so I didn't go, but I'm ready to get out and rally. And I guess I don't think of it so much as civil disobedience. It's just using my First Amendment rights. And I'm a person of faith. And I believe in the Great Commandment, not just love God, but we need to love our neighbor. And so I am there anytime that I feel like our neighbor is not being loved. So I'm proud to do that. And I'm not quite sure about the distinction between the violent. Then I do know that the people who have done it non-violently, like Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, didn't he get the Peace Prize? Who was the other person I'm thinking?
Gandhi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. These people, history has been very kind to them, not at the time necessarily, but looking back, history has been very kind to them and said that they were doing the right thing. So.
Yeah, y'all probably know this, but I learned it in my research for this. But what Gandhi did was there was a law against salt production. All the salt had to be imported, and that gave the the mother country and their merchants the profit from that. And so his big salt march was leading people, and it ended up like 10,000 people to the ocean, where he picked up sand that had salt in it. So at that point it was sort of symbolic, but the crime was taking steps to make salt. The Salt March.
I would like to add that rallies are not civil disobedience. And I'm all for rallies and for trying to convince people and get your point across and fighting for good instead of bad. But I think that the fact that people are refusing to follow subpoenas at the US Congress, that's civil disobedience, and that's wrong. I mean, breaking the law is one thing, and peacefully demonstrating is a completely different thing. And one can't be against that and want freedom. But I think that the principle of breaking the law is still something that we have to be very careful about in a democracy.
I think somebody's talking, but your mic is on. Are you related to Steve, SCH? Okay, turn your mic on.
Okay. I'm not sure that you would classify the refusal to obey a summons or whatever it was called. I don't think that's civil disobedience. I think that's just plain breaking the law for your own purposes, not for a higher cause.
Right. If you're not standing out there and say, take me to jail, I've committed the crime, put the handcuffs on me, then it's not civil disobedience.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's up to Garland to decide, evidently, but it's breaking the law.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
breaking the law and civil disobedience is basically synonymous. You
Not
can't-
according to the scholars. There is a difference between just a regular, but yes, if you want to say we have the moral obligation to obey the law, that's, you're not the only one with that position. You're in good company.
my only point is, Ron, you had mentioned about rallies and protests. What I've seen over my lifetime is, despite all the rallies and protests we have, a lot of them don't ever get any results. We had the Women's March, we had the protests on school shootings, and our government is not responsive to these actions. So I think civil disobedience is a drastic way to do it, but I think in some cases it's justified, and I really do. And most people, if you're willing to take the consequences of your actions, then I think that's one way to maybe bring about change. But rallies and protests don't seem to get it done. No matter how many people, 80% of the people in the country don't own guns, or some ridiculous figure like that I've seen. But yet there's no chance of getting any control over guns and weapons being produced. So I just think sometimes the government gets so out of whack and doesn't respond to what the people want that some actions have to be done. I mean, how many of us figure that if there had been civil disobedience that the Germans had taken against Hitler, or if somebody had taken the action to in fact eliminate Hitler, no matter how unsavory that action might be, how many lives would have been saved? So at some point, people have to stand up and I know violence is not a way, but sometimes that's the only way the human people can respond to things, I think, and as bad as it is. But if you're willing to suffer the consequences, I think that that's an indication of how far the issue has gone.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Is that it?
Emily, looks like you should wrap it up.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I'll say
Okay.
again, I love doing presentations related to climate. So if you've got any sort of group, please be in touch and give me or even my brother John that opportunity. So, but appreciate y'all, appreciate New Horizons. Come to Monday forum, Monday meeting. We just chat and chat and chat. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Emily. It was great.